Welcome back to the Rhodes to Wealth podcast. I'm your host, Josh Rhodes, and today's guest is Ben Krueger. Ben actually owns the CEO, founder of an organization called Cashflow Podcasting. I crossed paths with Ben really early in my sort of podcasting journey. He has a ton of free information through a blog, through his website, one of which was a free PDF book, and I'll talk about it here in the episode. I use that book to truly serve as a framework in building this podcast and the equipment that I use, my getting started steps, really even to the outreach portion of this. Ben started his career, actually started Cashflow Podcasting mid-2012, where a mentor and a really close friend of his had asked him for some assistance in editing his podcast. Ben sort of doubled down, really started to build some momentum, pulled on more than just his friend, but had several other clients that started to pay him for this. And today, Cashflow Podcasting, Ben's content is very focused on building a second stream, right? This podcast to feed your first stream of income. It's a really interesting approach. He focuses on coaches, mentors, teachers, those in the service industry. And really the goal of this podcast is to find and bring in more clients, right? So to feed your primary stream. I thought it was such a unique approach. I think it's something that's underserved, it's undervalued. And I mentioned this here in the episode. I've pitched this to my company now. I think it's a great idea. It's extremely low overhead. It's easy to get started. And folks love to talk, right? And so after chewing on a lot of Ben's information over the last year-ish, I had the opportunity to connect with him. After a quick chat, we decided to set this up, and I really appreciate his time. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Ben Krueger.
It's the road to the wealth. I do it for health. For my kids and my spouse. Financially sound. The bad dad.
Ben, man, I really appreciate you doing this. I mentioned offline your book on how to start a podcast that gets you more clients is one of, if not the first book that I picked up when I had the idea of starting this podcast. Yeah, I started talking to friends and family about, listen, I have this idea and I want to start a podcast and here's the direction I want to go. My stepmom was doing just some excitement research one night. Yeah, and sent me this link of, listen, this guy seems like he knows what he's talking about. You should do some research and look into him. I chewed on your material. I downloaded your book. I chewed on your book for, probably 60 days before transferring over to Dory Clark's book.
Nice.
I've had Dory Clark on the podcast. I started this in her interview in a very similar fashion of just kind of giving my dues and bowing out here of just, I really appreciate everything that you've done, sort of the front-loaded work and you doing that for me, saving me some time and helping me cut some corners. I used a ton of your advice, a lot of the questions during my planning phase, all the way down to I'm using the Audio Technica mic that you gave us or that you suggest. I'm using Zoom. It's all, I'm coming right from your portfolio. So I really appreciate everything you have going on, man.
Beautiful. Yeah, and that's part of the enjoyment I get out of doing all of this is we work in person with some folks as clients, but I know the majority of people that we're able to touch and help and impact are people that will never become clients. And that's great. I'm pumped about that because, we don't see it as like, oh, we're here to help people that have been in business a long time and they've got a checkbook and they can afford to get professional help with it. And that's the reason why we give all of our process and strategy and the fundamental concepts away for free so people can build their own stuff to make their impact through podcasting. And that's, at the end of the day, that's the fun part for me is like helping people get there. And the vehicle, whether it's information or services or coaching or whatever, is kind of secondary as to match what is important to that individual and kind of their piece. So it's really exciting to me. And I really appreciate you sharing all that because it keeps me going.
Of course, man. In fact, I want to kind of give you a second here just to maybe put the ball in your court of, for the folks tuning in, this is the first time they've heard of you or of your work. Do you mind just sharing a bit about who you are, what you have going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ben Krueger is my name. I founded a podcast production company in 2012 or 13, depending on who you ask. And I got into podcasting because at the time I was an intern with a group that taught the skills of starting a business from anywhere, like a location independent laptop lifestyle type business. And I really liked working with those guys. Ended up handling the production of their podcast, and they really liked my work. So they started referring a couple of people to me. But it really got interesting for me when I had an introduction where they wanted to start a podcast from scratch, and they wanted it to be a part of their brand, a part of the established way that they interacted with and built a relationship with their clients and customers and nurtured their list. And that's when it got really interesting for me, because he was essentially like, I know I can figure it out. I don't have the time, and I want to show up and be the host of the podcast. I want help with the strategy. I want help with the technical setup. I want help with the production. And I want to be able to focus on running my business and being the host of the podcast. I want everything else figured out for me. And I said, sweet, let's work together and figure it out. So he was my first launch client. And so then that kind of set me off on this whole path of like, how do I make starting a business podcast, A, really effective, and B, easy? So that's kind of the byline of the last couple of years here.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned there this business podcast. That's what I'm jotting down. I talked about Dory Clark here at the introduction. I feel I'm going to reference her a couple times, but on that episode, I had done some research pre-recording and found that there are 850,000 podcasts on the market today. Yeah, a lot of podcasts. And that is of all shapes, sizes, verticals. I mean, this is everything from sports to finance to self-help, cybersecurity. I mean, to the catch-all of Joe Rogan, right? Everything in between. Everything in between. So, and it goes without saying, but the self-help podcast or vertical is going to have a very different, strategy, content, and even outcome, right? An end goal for their listeners. So maybe I open the floor to you in that, understanding you're a bit specialized, I'd like to maybe start at the top and vague first. What are some reasons that you've found people want to start a podcast?
Yeah. And I love that you touched on, there's so many different approaches to podcasting. There's so many different categories and types. Because at the end of the day, all a podcast is recorded audio. So, you can literally go in whatever direction comes to mind with that.
Yeah.
And so, I've spent a lot of my time in the realm of podcasting in a way that helps businesses and brands connect with their audience and generate like tangible business results. So obviously my stuff kind of tailors in that direction. But when it comes to podcasting, there's quite a few reasons why somebody might get into it. They might be particularly interested in a topic, and they want to use a podcast as kind of like a vehicle for them to interview people, to share what they're learning, to build a community around themselves. They might want to do it out of like trying to establish credibility and authority for themselves, to network within an industry or network within a topic area. They might do it to, that classic grow my audience, and they can do it from a whole bunch of those. But what I find fundamentally, and this doesn't really matter whether it's an entertainment show or a business show or whatever, the core reason for podcasting as it relates to other mediums, because you can do video and you can do blogs and you can do emails and you can do, various other things. What podcasting allows you to do as an individual is create deep, emotional, intimate, connected relationships with many people. Mm-hmm. So the piece here is it's audio. So people are listening to you a lot of times in earbuds, sometimes it's on their laptop, sometimes it's in their car, whatever. But they get to hear your voice. They get to hear your intonation. They get to hear how you think about things, how you interact with certain topics or people. And they get much more of a sense of who you are as an individual than if they read a blog post. And video is really good for this intimate element as well. The only challenge with video is someone has to be directing 100% of their attention at consuming that piece of content in order to do so. So they got to be sitting there staring at the screen to watch a video. Whereas with podcasting, they can be out walking the dog. They can be going for a run, washing the dishes, driving to work, whatever it is they're doing. You can become part of their current routine. You can become an addition to it as opposed to something that they need to set aside time to directly 100% pay attention to. So those are some broad sweeping why podcastings. I really think it comes back to that intimate relationship piece fundamentally.
I love, man, I plan on drilling into that. I think that's fundamental in your approach. In fact, let's kind of head that way, in that I found, obviously through your book, through your website, your content, that you are very targeted, right? And you even preach in the book to be hyper-focused.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of focus.
Yeah, hyper-targeted. I love that. I guess maybe I open it to you on who are you targeting, and then how have you zeroed in on that group, right? Is that just your niche? Maybe have you found a pressing pain point that you feel you can help them overcome? So who and then why?
Great question. So one caveat to this is that this is what I see working most effectively for business podcasts, for shows associated with a brand. Just because, I say that doesn't mean that you can't do a business podcast that isn't hyper-focused, or that you can't do different types of shows that are, completely disregard the rules, because this, I'm talking about a very specific thing.
Sure.
That being said, for us, what we have found, and this tends to be true for any business, is the clarity of who your people are should evolve and define and redefine over time. Our most recent version is individuals we like to call industry advocates. So these are people that consider themselves educators, motivators, leaders in their industry, or they want to become leaders in their industry. And their primary vision for themselves and their role is helping their entire industry and their audience and client base grow, like helping grow the whole pie, as opposed to cutting a slice out for themselves. And that doesn't mean that they don't get anything. Generally, they're the ones that end up with most of the growth, because they're going in with that go-giver mindset. They're going in with that be an educator first mindset. And a perfect example of this is our client, Michael Kitzes, who has a podcast in the financial advisory space, and he's a big influencer and educator there. But on his About page, on the About Michael Kitzes thing, the very first bit says, I consider myself a lifelong learner, and through my platform, kitzes.com, I seek to then turn and share what I learn with you guys. So that's his whole thing, is he wants to be a lifelong learner. He wants to really understand building financial advisory businesses and that kind of, he wants to really get that space and then be an educator, be someone who teaches other people what he's figured out so that they can take that and run with it for themselves. So those are our people, the industry advocates, as it were. And the reason for that is because that mentality and that mindset really shines through effectively through podcasting as a medium. It just kind of, the two sync up and plug into each other really well. And folks that consider themselves the advocates and the educators, they have a powerful message. They are there to make an impact, a positive impact in some way. And so for us, it's a hell of a lot more fun and exciting to support those people than the people that are trying to make a couple bucks, or they're in it because they really essentially instant Instagram influencer type of stuff. Yeah. Honestly, that drives me nuts. So I'm just not interested personally.
So I love every episode I've had echoed, be as focused or as targeted as you can possibly be. I'm 40-ish episodes deep now, and it feels that in every episode, it's at some point brought up, you cannot be focused enough. I had Amos Schwartzfarb on here, one of the leaders in Techstars, an accelerator firm. He was talking to me about my 9-to-5 role where I sell a cybersecurity solution, and he was drilling me on, who are you selling to? And I was telling, CISOs on the West Coast. No, who are you selling to? CISOs in the healthcare space on the West, I could not be focused enough, right? So you're hyper-focused on anyone that has a business model that their goal is to help others get a bigger result in their lives or in their business. I mentioned I'm in a sales role. What really sort of struck a chord for me in your book is your breakdown of the sales funnel, right? And that there's a certain percentage of folks when they come to you that are just piping hot and ready to buy. And then most of which sort of are in the just kicking tires phase of this. And there's a long sales cycle likely on the back end of it. I don't want to steal your thunder here. Do you mind maybe
steal it away?
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Do you mind giving me maybe the Spark Notes version or kind of dig into this chapter for me? Yeah.
Totally. So this is actually a marketing study that I found and read through Dean Jackson, who's, a direct response copywriter, and he teaches different marketing concepts and really smart dude. But he talks about this marketing study where a firm did follow-up research for customers that inquired about a catalog from a company. I think it was about like pipe fittings or something. I don't know. It was very, very weird. But the research was they would follow up with these people at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, out to like 2 or 3 years. And what they found was of the people that inquired and showed interest in a catalog, only 15% bought the products they were initially interested in within the first 90 days. That's 3 months. Only 15% bought within the first 3 months. Now, to add to this, this is 50% of the people that asked for that information ended up buying some products in this area, and 15% of them ended up buying within the first 90 days. Now, 85% of them ended up buying anytime between 90 days and 2 years later, but not all of them bought from that company. So that's the ticket here. This is what kind of rubs me the wrong way about like really high pressure sales funnels and that kind of stuff. It's all about timing of where that person is in their journey and what's important and what's meaningful to them right then, because they can be interested in something, be in research phase like most of us are when we want to do something new or we're on a new journey or going into a new direction. Just kind of want to get a lay of the land, understand what you're looking at before you just start buying things left, right, and center. And that interest, me showing that interest, essentially says there's a good likelihood, a 50% chance that I'm going to buy something in this realm on this topic to help me in this area. And if you don't educate me, build a connection with me, keep me around, I'm going to buy it from somebody else because you are only the person that I'm interacting with right now. Whereas I might be ready to actually move and try to be ready to make the next step for a bigger result 6 months from now or 8 months from now or anytime in that 90 days to 2 year window.
It's a gut punch for me because I feel I came from this BDR sort of a business development background, prospecting and smiling and dialing. And I feel I'm probably at the more efficient or higher end of, I try to keep a really good cadence or touch point with prospects and customers. After reading that stat, I'll be the first to fall on that sword. If there's no way I keep a 2 year cadence, right? I've been at my company 4.5 years. There's no way I keep a 2 year cadence with these guys. To think that I've left your math, this study's math, 85% of the pipeline, I'm hyper-focused on the first 15% this next 30 to 60 days. And then the remainder of that pipeline, if you're not hitting them with good content and messaging and staying top of mind and getting on site and FaceTime and in their ears, you're losing out, right? And they're losing interest. You're not top of mind. And then when this project is a priority and they start to really evaluate and kick tires, they don't remember the conversation you had 2 years ago.
Yeah. And, why should they?
yeah, exactly.
Exactly. If it wasn't particularly valuable and there was no relationship established, it was purely a sales connection, then should I call up that used car salesman I talked to once 2 years ago? Like,
sure.
Nah, there's other cars out there. Yeah. And so I think part of this as well is like, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with like smile and dial. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with connecting with a lot of people up front to try to find the people who are ready right now.
Sure.
But there's so much more opportunity on the back end of all that 85% of people who just weren't ready right then but would still be a great fit. They're the exact type of person who could use what you have to sell or what you have to share and how you can help people. So what it comes down to is, instead of having to manually follow up and create a relationship with each and every individual, you can create a system for doing that at scale with leverage. And that's one of the values of podcasting.
That's perfect. And if you can kind of connect the dots for me here, I think this is really right down your alley, right? There's 85% of your funnel that goes sort of unchecked and untouched. For those that teach, coach, consult, service providers, financial advisors, those that are looking to benefit others, starting a podcast allows you to keep that cadence and touch point with that 85% of your funnel that's not ready to buy in the next 60 days.
Yep, absolutely. And then what's kind of beautiful about that is it compounds on itself in that those individuals who, they might have gone to work with somebody else or whatever, and now they're referring business to that other person that they worked with. And now they are introducing industry influencers from their network to that other person. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's that compounding effect of, if you can not only just keep these people in your realm, then when they are ready to take the next step, you're the person, but you're adding value the whole time. You're helping them get results in advance. You're sharing essentially social proof through your content testimonials or whatever. You're sharing stories. You are diving into some of those pieces. So you're creating a much deeper connected relationship than you could if you got them in the first week as a client. Even if those people never become a client, they can become great referral partners. They can become the person who shares your podcast with their investing group. You can become, all of those things. They can become your true fans or your loyal fans or lifelong fans or whatever. And there's a lot of value there, even if they aren't client potential.
It makes so much sense. Hearing you talk about it, and I've read this book, half a dozen times, more than that. It makes so much sense. I told you in an email, I actually pitched this to my organization. We're 750 employees. I cover 12 states on the West Coast, and I sat my company down in January and pitched this of, listen, don't spend any marketing funds on events or, giving me a table somewhere in California. Instead, let's spin this up. And I think this is really interesting. So I want to kind of dig into the business. By the way, they got shut down.
It's hard for people to understand that sometimes, but that's okay. Especially if they've been doing conferences we've been doing conferences for 15 years.
Yeah. But this avenue really intrigues me. I want to dig into what exactly this business model that you suggest looks like. In that, are you suggesting that these coaches and providers, are they interviewing potential customers? Are they interviewing industry experts? Are they just 100% by themselves in front of a microphone? Just talk to me a bit about where or how you've found your success and any guidelines or suggestions you have to offer up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the fun part is there is no right or wrong way to do it. And part of what a podcast is it's an expression of you as an individual, and it's an expression of the brand. So what we have found fundamentally is there's a lot of tactics and there's a lot of strategies. Some work, some don't. But regardless of the tactic or strategy, what is more important is the core principles that they're built upon. So this is something that I've really just been recently working on. And actually, we're going to release an update to the book that is about this concept, the 8 podcast principles. And so we kind of talk about what those principles are and kind of dive into them. But this whole idea of, should I interview people who are potential clients? Should I interview topic experts and share their expertise with my audience who are the potential clients? Or should I be the teacher, educator, coach, whatever, and talk directly with my audience or teach to my audience through my content? We work with clients who do every single one of those and do it very effectively. The primary thing here, though, is having clarity around who your people are, with that specificity and how you help them. So let's say a perfect example, we've got a gal who helps women physicians lose weight. It's like insanely specific. I probably even mentioned her in the book. Such a great example. But she very rarely does interviews or brings anybody else on the podcast. Most of her episodes are her hopping on a microphone and having a very simple conversation with her audience, teaching a mindset or a concept or talking through a particular challenge or helping them understand something around the idea of losing weight. One of the core principles that she uses with her stuff is weight loss is not about like hitting the gym and more miles and less calorie intake. It's about changing your relationship with your body image, and food. So her whole podcast teaches and helps women address, and women physicians specifically, speaking of specificity, to address some of those pieces. Now, in doing so, she's the educator, the coach, the one who is essentially sharing these mindsets and sharing this direction for women. And so that has a really strong positioning of her as the person who can help me get the result I want, which is to finally lose the weight once and for all, and to actually change my relationship with my body and my food as a general category, so that I feel good about myself, feel good about food. And, I don't feel like I'm that person at Thanksgiving who has to just like sit there with my hands on my lap.
Sure.
So that's like a great example of the pure teaching approach. Whereas what I see working really well for interviews is it's a little more, you can kind of do interviews one of two ways. One, you are the reporter whose job it is to extract the best value for your listeners. You're going in as somebody who is either like looking to learn in this space themselves, doesn't know anything, or, is in that learning process, more towards the beginning, and you're going in as the investigator. And that works really well when you are using kind of the storyline of come with me as I learn on this journey.
That is this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And it works great because people really connect with it because you're accessible. You're not so established and buttoned up, and your brand is so clean, and you wear the suit and tie, and you're totally unapproachable.
Right.
You're that person they can relate to, and they understand where you're at because that's where they are.
I say we're all in the same spot. Yeah.
Exactly.
On my website, I have, I remain a student to you all. No, that's sort of my big push. I stole that from Tim Ferriss.
Beautiful.
But that's it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah. What is that? Good artist copy, great artist steal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm a true believer. Yeah. True believer. Yep.
I want to know if what I pitched in January, and an idea that I've chewed on since, I've even toyed with the idea of funding it myself, the organization, is using this podcast, not this platform, but for the 9 to 5, as like a prospecting engine. As organizations reach out to us to become a customer, or as my BDRs are reaching out to organizations to talk to them, instead of pitching them and trying to sell to them, positioning this in that, do you want to come on the platform and talk about some of the issues that you're dealing with? And then it's the same, 45-minute sales call that I would have without recording it. Instead, we record it. We put that out to the public because that interview is so thorough. And if you ask good questions and he enjoys that conversation, there's a really good chance that, one, he's going to want to tune into his episode. He's going to also want to know, what are others saying, right? And that he'll become a follower of that content. What it sounds like to me is what you sort of pitched is the goal here is not to have 3 million followers, but it's to find those that don't buy from you immediately and to keep that cadence with them. And so if they reach out to the organization, hey, we're interested in kicking some tires, and you put them on your platform and they become a listener, then during the next 2 years, they've sort of baked you into their routine. And even if you have, 200 listeners and they're all potential customers, that's exactly who you want.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I love this idea of using the podcast as a prospecting tool, because if you reach out to somebody like, oh yeah, do you have issues with your cybersecurity? Let's jump on and talk about it. That's clearly a sales pitch.
Definitely.
So they just go in knowing that that's a sales pitch, which is fine. But if you reach out to them and say, hey, we have a podcast where we highlight the expertise of folks in software departments, particularly around cybersecurity or, whatever.
Exactly.
That is a value first interaction. You're reaching out to them to feature them to your audience, to extract their expertise, to understand their situation and their, what they're dealing with, which fundamentally from a sales perspective, that's what leads to a good sale, is feeling like somebody understands your problem. They understand your situation. And it's that classic, if they understand your problem better than you do, then you assume they have the solution, even if they maybe don't. But
yeah.
That's a whole other thing. And then you featured them on your platform. That's an interview. That's a news article piece for them. That's something they can feature to their networks. That's something they can share within their company, within their departments, to other departments, that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. If you think I'm not going to share this with my manager, that's fine. That's fine.
Let's sweeten the pot then, because what happens is you started that relationship on giving value first, and then that gives you infinite reason to follow up over time with other things. So let's say 2 months down the line, you have another conversation with somebody whose story is a little bit similar or something, and they had a slightly different approach to their software, managing their department or addressing cybersecurity. And you can reach back out to somebody you've already had on the show and say, hey, John, yeah, I remember on our conversation, we talked about this, wanted to share this as a resource, just published this episode featuring this other individual who had a pretty creative solution to what you're talking about. You're that guy or person who is following up with help, not badgering the crap out of them to get them to buy your thing. But you're offering that help, and you can also say, you can always have that next step available for them when they're ready to take it. So you're not just sending them cash and not making any clear ask or making anything. You're essentially sending them value, and at the same time making it clear to them that if they want to have a next step conversation, you're there and ready for that.
Yeah. I love this idea on so many levels. I've mentioned Dory Clark now, I feel, a handful of times. This will be my last, I feel.
Never. Keep bringing her. Yeah.
This will be my last. In our conversation, we talked about how just managing 2 streams of income is really difficult. At the time, she had 8. And keeping 8 afloat is, it's atrocious, right?
That's a full-time job, managing the income cash streams.
Exactly. And so what I love about this is, what I love about starting a podcast is, I guess, her suggestion to me when I made the point of exactly that point of managing 8 sounds ridiculous. Getting the first plate spinning is always the hardest. After that, you can stack the second one on, the third one on, and they begin to spin sort of by themselves. Starting this podcast feels like a great first plate, right? Because you can start this podcast and then you start to build some momentum. Not only does this have the chance to produce some revenue, but this can feed back into your primary job, right? You're talking to customers. They're going to come back and buy from you. And then even furthermore, if you're having good conversations, you're building content. From there, you can take those conversations, write a book around that content. People do that all over the place. I've seen even more them aggregate their interviews and content and things that they've extracted and start to speak on it. Right? Listen, I've talked to the top 50 entrepreneurs over the last 4 months, and I want to share what I've learned. That's great. Write books around or start public speaking around, or if you want to spin up a mastermind group and say, hey, those that are sort of in my area, you guys follow this, right? I mean, there's so many other income streams that can feed off of you having sort of a well-produced or put together podcast.
Yeah. And talk about a credibility and authority indicator. If I interviewed the, top 100 entrepreneurs in the fashion industry. And so I'm spinning up a group to talk about the most successful elements of the fashion industry, entrepreneurship, yada, 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 yada.
Exactly.
Like you're in just, that's instant credibility there, because you can go from nobody to the person who's extracting all those insights from all these top individuals.
At extremely low overhead, right?
Yeah.
I've got a USB microphone. We're on a free software with Zoom, computer. I hit you up on LinkedIn or email, and that's it, right?
Yep.
From there, especially if you're going to do some sort of, if you're going to edit this yourself, I mean, it's really low overhead to get this thing up and running and to start to really build the momentum.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of, I always share with people to get help, but it doesn't mean you need to hire an editing service and whatever. Help looks like software that automates the process, or a simple microphone that just plugs in with a USB instead of having a mixing board and all this other nonsense that you don't need to sound good. Exactly. So I'm a big fan of simplify and get the help at whatever level you can afford. And generally that's software and free information. I put out a ton of it, so you could use some of that. Sounds like, and I know Dory, I've done a couple of interviews with Dory over the years here. Sure. Since we've both been at it a while. She's incredibly sharp, puts out a lot of great information as well. And so, between those two as starting point sources, that should get you 90% of the way.
I totally agree. Yeah, I couldn't echo that enough. I want to spend maybe just one question here for the folks that are not going to follow your path. They're not going to follow they're not a teacher or a provider or a service. Maybe they just have a couple friends that they have really funny conversations as they sit around in the living room and they say, we should record this.
Totally.
Or for the folks that want to build the network, right? Whatever it is it possible for those folks to turn this into a revenue stream? And if so, how, right? Do you mind just kind of running through maybe some of the industry numbers or whatever you have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for those kind of shows, I kind of, in my brain, I classify that as like an entertainment show. Exactly. Whether it's for your own entertainment or the audience's.
Sure.
Either way, the classification is the same. And what the reality of these types of shows look like is it's based on, you get paid for having an audience and you get paid for the desirability for being in front of that audience. So if you're having conversations over beers about philosophy and that kind of stuff, awesome. That's a great conversation. The types of individuals who are interested in listening to a podcast about philosophy, it's not very targeted. So it's going to be hard to get premium sponsorship dollars based on that.
Yeah.
But that's okay. The core driving factor here. And when you're going into it with more a love of the game and a love of the topic and what you're there for, that's going to shine through and be more important. Whereas the monetization side is more like, let's cover my costs,
Yeah, absolutely.
But fundamentally, there's kind of three strategies that I see for monetizing these types of shows. And, you could argue till you're blue in the face that there's like 1,000, but whatever. We'll boil it down to the simple ones. One is the classic typical industry sponsorship through podcasting. So what this looks like is a pre-roll, mid-roll, a little ad at the beginning of the episodes, an ad maybe in the middle or in the end. So you can record it as the host or have an audio file from the sponsor. Realistically, and how that works is you get paid per 1,000 downloads for that episode. And so what it generally works out to is somewhere between $15 and $60 per episode per 1,000 downloads. And that's based on how long is the segment, how many segments are there, the beginning of the episode, middle of the episode, end of the episode. There's a couple of different pricing structures there. And you can, if you have one sponsor for the beginning, you could have another sponsor for the middle. You could do it Tim Ferriss style to where he personally talks about the companies that he's doing, which is going to be much more effective than
definitely
oh yeah, here's Joe Schmo brand. So generally having product services that you personally use and endorse is going to be much more effective across the board, regardless of industry or topic. And then the other route to sponsorship, which I think personally is a little bit more exciting and interesting, is what I kind of call company partnerships, where you reach out to companies in your industry that are very specifically interested in getting in front of your audience, like the type of people that you attract, and you essentially wheel and deal and come up with a sponsorship package for them individually. These are usually companies that are not used to sponsoring podcasts, so there's an education element where you need to essentially like tell them how it's going to work. One great way that I've found to find these types of companies that are generally more open to these sponsorships is look at conferences in that topic area. So if you do a podcast around hunting, or if you do a podcast around whatever, like home brewing, look at conferences and events, live events around those topics, and you can see who sponsored those events. You can oftentimes see how much they paid to sponsor those events. A lot of times you can see how many people came to those events. So you can get a sense for how much these companies are willing to pay to get in front of those people. And obviously you need to believe in what the company's doing. You need to support what they're about and how they work with or help people. Because if it's not genuine and authentic, then you might as well just not even bother.
Yeah.
But then you can reach out to these kinds of companies with a soft pitch to see if they're interested in sponsoring and partnering with you to be like the featured sponsor for the podcast. And you can structure it in a ton of different ways. So here's where it gets real creative is they can be the sponsor where for a month you have them as a pre-roll and a mid-roll, a little ad. You can have them on and interview them as part of the podcast. You can bring somebody in as a co-host and do it as the podcast that, you can kind of like do for the month. We're going to brand as in partnership with so-and-so company. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. So there's kind of like this loose form wheeling and dealing, Wild West approach.
Sure. Yeah.
It makes it a little bit hard or a little bit intimidating sometimes. But if you approach it with a mindset of like, I'm here to have fun and see what comes of it, that's much more effective and a lot more relaxed than like, all right, I got to find a corporate sponsorship for my podcast.
Yeah, I love getting out of the box a bit and being able to negotiate and kind of have some fun with, just the unorthodox approach, right? I like the idea of maybe bringing in, letting them be the host of your podcast for an episode, or interviewing one of their seed levels and stuff. I mean, I love that.
You can also go the listener supported route, and that's a whole nother thing. Using something like Patreon, you can essentially like create content only for folks that are financially supporting you through Patreon, which is like people can pledge $5 a month or $10 a month, whatever they want. That being said, unless you have a very like a cause focused podcast, that's going to be a tough sell.
I think Tim tried to do that for a little bit, and then I think it only lasted a few months, and then he pulled out of that. Like, which this isn't for me.
If he's not pulling that off, then it's going to be tough for you unless you have like, that being said though, if you have a podcast where you talk about adult literacy or there's a cause that you are about or something that people can get behind, it's a movement, it's like the
cleaning the ocean.
Whatever, ocean cleanup, plastic waste reduction, whatever.
Sure.
Like that, you can absolutely get people behind and get people supporting, especially if you're doing other things on top of the podcast as a way to influence positive change in that direction.
Definitely. I talked a bit earlier about how easy it is to get something like this up and running. Hence the reason there are 850,000 of them out there.
Yep.
Do you have any sort of cookie cutter getting started steps in that? I mean, this is your world. You've done research. You have content around. By the way, I should probably plug all of this can be found at your website, and I'll make sure it's attached in the show notes and all that good stuff. But I'd like to extract some of the juicy details or first steps of someone wants to get a podcast started. Do you have any suggestions as far as processes, equipment, softwares, just any and all of it?
Totally. So a lot of our content, our site is cashflowpodcasting.com, but we put together a resources page at thepodcastprinciples.com. And that's where we've got this book. That's where we've got a scorecard that people can assess their own podcast idea. That's where, we've got all of our top stuff. We've got some training, like little video seminars and stuff there too. And this is for people who want to podcast for a brand, for a business. So that really lays out a very clear step-by-step kind of process for conceptualizing, coming up with an idea, clarifying how it's going to work, and taking the first steps. There's that side of it. And then there's the like, I want to start a podcast because I'm interested in this topic and it's a little bit more of a hobby show. And if you want to go the very planned and purposeful route, I'm a big believer in start with the fundamental principles, and that, you know, whether it's a business podcast or not, like the podcast principles, the book and the scorecard and that kind of stuff is going to be really helpful for that. That's where you start. If you have a really purposeful podcast, you're like particularly there to make an impact or like generate results for people, whether it's you or otherwise. The audience or the industry or people around a particular topic or group.
Sure.
The more hobby type show, like I want to do this for me and I'm excited about this topic and let's see what happens with it. I'm a huge fan of keep it real simple, get started. And what that looks like really is you don't need to buy a fancy microphone. If you got a pair of earbuds with a little microphone on it, you can start there. If you've got $80 to spend, you can buy an Audio-Technica ATR 2100 microphone like both of us are using.
Yep.
It just plugs in with a USB right to your laptop, whether you've got a Mac or PC, and you're off into the races. For recording, if you're going to do calls, you can use Zoom for free for the most part, unless you're doing some hardcore calling.
Yeah, unless it's a group call, right? I mean,
Exactly.
one-on-one. Yeah, one-on-one.
Yep.
Yeah, this is totally free.
It's free, yeah. So you can absolutely do that. You can also use, like if you've got a Mac, you can pop up GarageBand, which comes natively. If you have a PC, you can use a tool called Audacity, which is free. You can just search Audacity and download it, whether you have a Mac or a PC. So like the tech part is pretty easy. And I talk a little bit about kind of the tech stuff in some of our content just to get people going. Yeah, there's kind of those two elements there. There's the strategic part, and then there's the like technical, what do I do part, the how to and where do I start?
I think what you've provided on top of, and you gave us the resource there at the podcastprinciples.com, I think that's a hell of a first step. I know I've got just a couple minutes here. I want to open the floor one more time to you in that I've done a little hopping around. I feel we've covered a couple different topics. Is there anything worth jumping into, or just I kind of want to open the floor to you? Have I not covered anything? Is there anything worth talking about? Yeah, I know.
What do we do? I think when it comes to podcasting, like it's something that can be so much fun. And a lot of people approach it with kind of this like heavy seriousness sometimes that I see. And it's a little weird to see that.
Sure.
Because it can be a lot of fun. I think purely, or part of it is because it can feel a little bit intimidating. Like you're recording your voice and you're putting it out there and maybe thousands of people could listen to it. If you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed or intimidated by the process, I'm a big fan of like, sit down and record some stuff. You don't have to release it. Like, it doesn't have to go out there. Or you can release it and just share it with a couple of people just to start. Like, it can be whatever level and medium you want it to be. So, like, there is no right or wrong. I need to do it this way, or I should do it that way, or I started with it doing interviews, so I need to do interviews forever. That's nonsense. Like, do it in whatever format, in whatever direction really kind of suits you and how you want to do it and what feels fun and relaxed and easy and interesting to you, because that's where it's going to actually resonate with other people, is when it's fun, interesting, and exciting and relaxed and you're having fun with this as a project as opposed to it being another to-do list item.
Man, I'm going to close on the thought as well. That kind of just, you running through that kind of makes me think about when I got this podcast started. Dory mentioned in her book that most podcasts go dark before they hit their 16th episode, right? And that it's like they want to get the ball rolling and then it's just too much work, or They release a couple episodes and they don't have the following. And so they just fall off. I took that to heart. And so I recorded over 25 episodes before I pushed the green button.
You're not a go-getter at all, baby.
Before I went live with the first, I had queued up 25. The first 3 or 4 of them were not that good.
Of course they weren't.
They were not that good.
Yeah.
And I'm giving myself too much credit. It's probably more than that. I'm still learning, right? But yeah, in one of those first episodes, I interviewed a guy, John Livesey, and he's known as the pitch whisperer. And when we got offline, his advice to me was, he kind of told me the story about he and a friend of his wanted to start a podcast about the same time. And John said, from a sales perspective, he's a sales guy, the pitch whisperer, right? As a sales guy, I'm not overly technical. I'm not into scraping and editing all of the video and audio, so I outsourced it. My friend she decided to do this on herself. He said, we got started at the same time. Today, I'm over 100 episodes. She has 0. And so I think the moral of the story there is to understand your expertise and really the value of your time, right? I fall in that same bucket in that I'm a dinosaur on technology. And so to sit down and do the homework for a podcast, record the podcast, then post podcast, sit down and do all the editing for it and write and ensure the transcript's right and do this and do that. It's out of my bucket. I don't want to spend my time on it. And so I outsourced it. If you have that ability, obviously, if the thought of editing excites you or if that's what you do or whatever, then run with it, right? But don't let that scare you from launching, right? If there's anything that you could possibly look at outsourcing, my suggestion, which for whatever that's worth, is to at least outsource that piece.
Yep.
That's all I've got, man.
I totally agree. And I'm a big fan of get help at whatever level works for your situation. So if you have the resources and I have a little bit of money, my value is my time and my expertise. Let me show up and be the expert and have other people who know and can handle all the rest of it. Awesome. Use a service that has that stuff dialed in. That's what they're there for. If you I really like writing the show notes part, but I need somebody else to help me button up the audio and I need find some part-time contractor help you can pay by the hour to do that kind of stuff. There's literally a way to get help to make the process easier and more streamlined at whatever budget and at whatever involvement level you want. So it comes down to getting started, getting help at whatever level you're currently at, knowing that may shift and change and evolve over time. But that simplification allows you to get into the game and not be that person that 2 years from now we're having a conversation about I thought about starting a podcast and would still love to, but haven't gotten around to it yet.
Ben, man, I'm a couple minutes over. Brother, I really, really appreciate your time. When I jump into these interviews, just due to some of the legwork I do offline, I jump in here with pretty high expectations. And man, I could not have written better sort of outcome or interview. I mean, this is, you crushed it, man. For the folks that just didn't get enough of this today, they need more of you. They want to find your content. You gave us the podcast principles earlier. Where can they tune in? Where can they get a hold of you at?
Yep, that's going to be a great starting point. The home of our brand is cashflowpodcasting.com. Those are our services. And I am most active. I am the worst person on social media. So talk about sticking to your strengths. So you can find me via email, and a lot of my contact info is at cashflowpodcasting.com. So that's an easy way to interact with me. Because, I think the last time I posted on Facebook was it's all those, when everybody wishes you happy birthday on Facebook, once a year. And there was literally no posts in between years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's me. So that's going to be the best way to interact with me just because that's where I land. But that being said, I am happy to help folks out. If you've got questions, if you are looking to get started in podcasting and just get stuck anywhere, feel free to reach out because I'm always happy to be helpful and be a resource in this space.
Awesome, man. I mentioned your book earlier on how to start a podcast that gets you more clients. You can find that on your website. I can't recommend that as well as the rest of the content that you guys have produced enough. Links to everything discussed, including the website, a lot of the content that we've discussed, that'll all be in our blog post at roadstowealth.com. That's all I've got for the listeners. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. As always, stay on your grind.
Well, if you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of not only Ben, but the message and the content that they create and push out to the market. I mentioned it in the introduction here, but I truly feel that this is an approach that's missing across the board, and if not all, most verticals. It's absolutely missing in the cybersecurity realm. I'm sure for those of you that decide to truly, do some digging into really your own vertical, you'll find the same. And how easy, right? You invest in a cheap microphone or a headset, Zoom is free, and you start reaching out to prospects or those that you'd like to work with, do business with. And instead of trying to sell them, you interview them and you have them sell themselves. The idea that you're able to keep a more significant and regular cadence with those prospects that don't move quickly, I rolled around in all that information. I really, really enjoyed it. Sort of pivoted there in the middle and really appreciated Ben willing to reveal the other side of the curtain on how we can actually make money from the podcast, right? There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out of the market today, all of them with different goals, right? Some for entertainment, some with the purpose of making advertising revenue. I appreciate him sort of walking us through the broad spectrum there of how we can make money, both in creative and more traditional ways. I truly think, though, that the idea of getting this plate spinning to feed back into the original, your primary job, what a great idea. It's really easy, quick to get started. In fact, I think that's what I'll close with, Ben's idea there at the end of keep it real simple and get started. Appreciate your ears. Stay on your grind.
So smooth, you know what I'm saying? Q1 made the beat, by the way, just to let y'all know what's going on. Tell them, it's the road to the wealth, yeah. I do it for health, yeah. It's the road to the wealth, yeah. With my kids and my spouse, yeah. It's the road to the wealth. I do it for health, yeah. With my kids and my spouse, yeah. I'm financially sound, yeah. It's the road to the wealth, yeah. I do it for health, yeah. With my kids and my spouse, yeah. I'm financially sound. If life about purpose, it give you something to seek in. I've been setting cash goals, financially speaking. I've been finding blessings through all of these demons. I pray to God, I give you something to reach with. I give you something to leave with. This life about goals and achievements. Your eyes on the prize, the hate out your mind, and pray to whatever beliefs in. Teach on the way, know that they're reaching the way. Gotta shine hard in the teacher's water, know that little seed, they gon' grow tomorrow. So every day, gotta come with us. So they give you something to stand on. Make the false off when you land raw. Make you put some new friends on. It's the road to the wealth. I do it for help, yeah. My kids and my spouse, yeah. I'm financially sound. It's the road to the wealth, yeah. I do it for help, yeah. My kids and my spouse, yeah. I'm financially sound. You the bad dad.